If you're trying to conceive and quietly wondering if life can be whole without a baby, feeling anxious, uncertain, or weary in your faith, you're not alone. Welcome to the Infertility and Trying to Conceive podcast for Christian women. I'm Linda Renee, an Aussie wife, mum, and follower of Jesus. Here I share biblical truth, simple conception tips, offer emotional support, and have honest conversations about what struggling to conceive really looks like as a Christian woman. My prayer is that this podcast lightens your load, keeps you anchored in Christ, and helps you move forward with confidence, peace, and hope. Christ goes before you, and I'm right here helping you look to Him every step of the way. Let's begin. Hello, and welcome to the Infertility and Trying to Conceive podcast. So today I want to talk about something that can be really common when trying to conceive, and that's depression. The trying to conceive road is really rough, and something that I think makes it even harder is that sometimes you don't even realize how hard it is until you're already in it. People on the outside don't get it. Half the time you can't even talk about it because it's not exactly the kind of thing that you just want to casually bring up at a barbecue. But infertility is actually a hugely stressful experience, and it affects so many areas of your life. And when you're carrying disappointment and uncertainty for such a long time, it makes sense that it can start to affect you emotionally too. And I think I've mentioned this stat before, but somewhere between 1 in 4 and 1 in 3 women going through infertility actually meet the criteria for clinical depression. And so that's not just a rough patch or having a bad day because your period came or feeling sad after an appointment. It can start to feel like you're stuck, like you're not really yourself and you can't quite work out how to move forward. And so I want to say before we get into this that feeling sad or disappointed or angry or exhausted or having days where you just don't feel like yourself after something as painful as infertility isn't automatically a sign that there's something wrong with you. Grief is a really normal response to loss and uncertainty, and we deal with that so much in infertility and loss. But sometimes, especially when disappointment keeps happening over and over again, it can become hard to know when normal grief ends and where you might actually need some extra support. So today I want to share 5 things that might be helpful. And they don't necessarily fix infertility. And I can't even promise that any of these things will make the uncertainty or the waiting easy, but they might help you navigate this hard chapter in your life in a way where infertility doesn't become the only thing that you can see. So I think a really hard thing when you're going through infertility is that sometimes you're not actually just grieving the baby that you're waiting for. You're also grieving how you thought your life would look like by now. And I think most of us, we've probably had some kind of picture in our heads before we started trying. It might have been falling pregnant easily and giving your family a surprise announcement at Christmas, or, getting pregnant at the same time as your best friend and having baby bumps together, or whatever that picture might have been for you. And for some of us, life or God is actually rewriting that story in ways that we never expected, or with fertility treatments we never imagined needing, or decisions that we never thought we'd have to make. And that can be really difficult because I think too, we underestimate the grief surrounding trying for a baby in infertility because we don't always realize what we're actually grieving. It might be the pain of losing a pregnancy, or the waiting, or the uncertainty, or the future that you thought you would have by now. It might even be all of them. But you can still grieve over the future that you might have pictured. And sometimes grief just sits there quietly because you don't even realize that that's what you're actually carrying. I remember when we were trying for a baby, I had this idea in my head of how I hoped things would happen. But when that didn't happen, it wasn't just the negative tests or all the other things that felt crushing. It was also the picture in my mind of what I thought my life would look like was changing. And so I think this is where it can be really helpful to ask, are there parts of the story that you imagined for your life that you're grieving right now? Sometimes naming what we're actually grieving helps us understand why this hurts so much. Because when we can name what's actually causing the pain and hurt and these hard emotions, we can bring that specific thing to God and we can process it and respond to it rather than just feeling overwhelmed by a general sense of everything is wrong. And the Bible is full of people bringing disappointment and confusion and grief and honesty before God. I know I refer to Hannah in the Bible quite a bit, and she's the classic go-to with infertility, I think, at times. But she's a good one. She was so upset that she couldn't eat. She was so distressed while praying that Eli the priest thought she was drunk. And when I think about the times where I felt so inconsolable after another devastating result, I might not have been far off looking like I was drunk at times too. Hannah falls apart in front of God, and Scripture doesn't tell it as a story about her having weak faith because she was devastated. It just tells it as what happened and shows us a woman who desperately wants a baby, bringing her deep, heart-aching pain before God. And you really aren't on your own in this. So many of us end up with a story that we never planned. It doesn't make you less of a woman or less loved or less faithful for how your life has actually panned out. So if this has affected you more deeply than you expected, it's absolutely valid. You're not failing in life or your faith because this has been harder than you thought it would be. I think too that part of what makes infertility so exhausting isn't just the daily struggle, but that constant feeling that our life isn't matching the picture that we had in our minds. And like Hannah, that's something worth bringing to God, because even when this season feels all-consuming, it isn't the whole story. There is a hope we have in Christ that goes beyond what happens in this life. And it doesn't erase the grief, but it does give us something solid to hold on to in the middle of it. So the next thing I think that's worth talking about is thankfulness. And I know that word can sometimes feel a little bit loaded, especially when you're in the middle of something really painful. I hear people talking about gratitude journaling lots, and I actually first heard about gratitude journals on Oprah when I was a teenager, and I started one way back then. And I think the goal was to write 3 things a day that you're grateful for. And it sounds easy, right? There's loads of studies that show that gratitude journaling has real benefits. And I do think there's real value in learning to notice the good things in life or the good things that God has placed in front of us and be grateful for them. But I actually found this one kind of hard, especially when I was going through infertility. At the start, it felt good doing it, but it slowly turned into just another thing to do on my list, another tick box. So I'd either just write whatever I could think of and slap it on the page, because the idea was to find something different from what I'd previously written. Or I'd just sit there at the end of a hard day and think, I can't really think of anything that I'm grateful for today. It was a pretty rubbish day. And so when I couldn't think of much, I'd feel even worse. And so I ended up actually writing letters to God instead. I would pour out whatever was actually going on, the disappointment, the frustration, the stuff that I didn't understand. And then sometimes a few months later, I'd go back and I'd read them. And I'd see a prayer that I'd completely forgotten that I'd prayed. Or I'd notice things that I hadn't seen at the time. And I'd see how God had carried me through a week that I only remembered as being hard. And I really found that quite encouraging. But in saying that, it didn't always help me see what he was doing right there in the moment, because I couldn't always just sit down and write a letter in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. One thing I've noticed is that suffering has a way of filling your whole field of vision. After enough disappointment, it's easy to stop noticing much else because the hard thing feels so big. And I wonder if that's one reason that Paul so often links prayer and thankfulness together in the Bible. It's not just pretending everything's okay or trying to look on the bright side, but while we're pouring out our hearts to God, we're also reminding ourselves of what's still true about him. The disappointment is real, but it isn't the only thing that's real. And so I think doing this works best when it's specific. Saying something like, I'm grateful or I'm thankful for my husband can become a bit like a checklist. It's true, but it's not very specific. Something like, the way my husband made a joke at the exact moment that I needed one is actually being a little bit more specific. And I think that's the key to not turning it into a checklist. Maybe it's the sun finally coming out after 5 days straight of rain and actually feeling the warmth on your face, or raindrops hanging off leaves and looking like something out of a jewelry box. Or it could be a photo someone shared with you that just stops you for a second. Or maybe it's smaller than that, a potato peeler that works, or ad-free telly, or a cup of tea when your hands are cold. It doesn't have to be this big thing. And I do think it's different to just, that whole staying positive, because, if you're being vaguely grateful for a good coffee, that doesn't really go anywhere. But when you actually believe that God's involved in the small stuff of your life and not just the big stuff, thankfulness then has a focus. You're not just noticing something nice happened, you're thanking someone for it. And the Bible doesn't just tell us to notice the good things. It actually tells us to give thanks to God for them, which is a different, more personal thing than just positive thinking. And I think that's a really important thing to highlight, because the Bible doesn't tell us to just pretend that painful things are good. Infertility is painful, and you don't have to thank God for infertility itself, but you can still thank him in the middle of it. for his kindness in saving you, or his presence when you can't always feel it, or for the ways that he's giving you strength today, even if it's been tough. So maybe try this instead of a list. At the end of your day, just name one real, specific thing that you can intentionally thank God for. You can say it out loud or write it down, and it may just help you remember what's true and keep you from losing the whole day to all the other hard things. And so the next thing to consider is paying attention to your relationships. Infertility can be really hard on relationships. It can take up that much space in your life that everything else might just start to revolve around infertility as well. And sometimes, even without meaning to, the things and people that were already important to you can start just getting pushed to the side. You might stop saying yes to things because you don't know how you feel when you go to that event. Or maybe you pull away because you're tired of explaining all the time what's going on. Or you feel like no one really understands anyway. And this isn't always intentional. Sometimes you're just exhausted, or you don't want to explain yourself again. Or you don't want to sit at dinner and hear another person announce their pregnancy when you're already struggling. And I completely understand why that happens. Sometimes you just don't have the emotional capacity. And there are seasons where you just need to rest and care for your well-being. But I do think a question worth asking is, have you pulled away because you need space right now? Or has infertility slowly started taking away some of the relationships that were actually helping carry you through this? Because these people matter. Your husband matters, your friends matter, your family matters. The people God has placed around you are still really important parts of your life, even while you're waiting for the baby that you deeply long for. And with your husband especially, I think this can happen really easily. Your marriage can feel more like two people just managing appointments and making decisions and trying to figure out the next best step. And all these conversations, they need to happen because they're part of your reality. But I think something worth noticing is that even though trying to conceive can connect you together, you fight for the same goal, I think it can sometimes become the only thing you end up talking about. And if that happens, it can start feeling like you're not even husband and wife anymore. At some point, you might just look up and wonder, is this all we talk about now? Are we still just us? Your marriage is more than just having a baby. You're still two people who need connection and laughter and normal conversations and moments where infertility isn't the center of everything. Sometimes hard things can bring you closer, and sometimes they actually really expose the things that are already difficult. But I do think there's some real value in intentionally doing things together that have nothing to do with trying to conceive. I've probably used this example before, but one of my favourite things that Brad and I used to do was get a load of firewood together. It probably sounds weird, but we had a purpose and a goal. We were working together, and at the end of it, we actually achieved something, keeping our house warm through the winter. It was super basic, but it made us feel like we were a team. And the other thing I loved about something like that was that we didn't always have to talk. Sometimes we just worked in comfortable silence. Maybe for you, it's a weekly sunset walk. Maybe it's sitting outside after dinner. Maybe it's camping every few months. Or maybe it's just turning off the TV and cuddling together for 10 minutes, even if it's in silence. It doesn't have to cost money or be some big romantic gesture. But in terms of relationships as a whole, I do think it's worth asking whether infertility has become the main thing that your relationships are built around right now. And what's one small thing that you could do to remind yourself that your life is bigger than just this one struggle? So number 4 is asking yourself, are you constantly searching for the thing that will finally fix it? Sometimes, you can just hope that you find the right supplement or the right diet or the right specialist. If you could just find that one thing, this would finally work. And I get it. When so much feels out of your control, doing something feels better than nothing. And of course that makes sense, but chasing every new fix mostly leaves you stressed and tired and confused and not more pregnant. And as Christians, sometimes it's not always a supplement or a treatment that we're trying to find. It's kind of like a formula. Praying a certain way because you heard that it worked for somebody else, or feeling like you just have to have enough faith, or saying the right thing, or believing hard enough. Then that would be the thing that finally moves God to open your womb. And one thing I noticed in myself was that faith became just another thing to measure myself against. I'd be wondering, am I trusting enough? Did I pray the right way? Did I doubt too much yesterday? And that led me to looking at my own faith and what I could do more than looking at Christ and what he'd done for me and what he says he will do for me. When I read the Bible, I don't see Jesus inviting weary people to have perfect faith before he welcomes them. I see him meeting them in the middle of their weakness and their questions and their doubts and their anger. I find that really comforting because it means my standing with God, it isn't just changing every time my emotions do. On the days that I felt full of faith, he hadn't loved me more. And on the days where I felt numb or questioned what he was doing, he hadn't stepped away either. So I think it's worth focusing on some of the boring stuff, eating well, sleeping, looking after your well-being. Those things probably won't feel exciting, but they're the ones that are actually worth your energy. There's no verse in the Bible that promises you a magic fix for infertility, and no formula that guarantees a miracle. But there are plenty of verses that call us to be wise with what's actually in front of us instead of running ourselves into the ground, chasing the next thing or the next prayer that we think will finally unlock it. So the last thing before we finish, and this one's for anyone who's really been struggling for a while, don't wait until you hit rock bottom before getting support. I think we sometimes treat emotional health and mental health and even spiritual health differently to how we treat physical health. If you consider that if you broke your leg, you probably just wouldn't sit there and do nothing. You'd go and get it looked at, right? You'd get support. You'd do what you needed to do to heal. But somehow when it comes to our emotional and mental health and spiritual health too, we often wait until we're completely exhausted before we admit that we might need some help. One thing I've learned is that depression doesn't always look like the way we expect it to. It isn't always obvious. Sometimes it can just feel like, you've lost your spark. You don't really feel like yourself anymore. You're getting through the days, but that's about it. You might find yourself pulling away from people that you'd normally enjoy being around. Maybe things that used to bring you joy don't feel the same. Or maybe your thoughts are constantly circling around infertility and you feel like you just can't switch off. And if that's been going on for a while, don't just put it down to infertility and assume that you have to live with it. It is okay to ask for help. And getting support doesn't mean that you're failing spiritually or that you're not trusting God enough. God cares for us even through ordinary ways, through people, through doctors, counsellors, and the community that He's put us in. Sometimes we just need someone outside of our own head who can help us sort through what's going on and walk with us through it. So please don't wait until you've been struggling for months or you feel like you just can't cope anymore before deciding that it's bad enough to get help. You don't need to hit rock bottom to get support. And linking back to, your broken leg analogy, nobody thinks twice when a top athlete has a coach or a physio or a nutritionist or even a psychologist in their corner. Nobody thinks a CEO is weak for having a board of people around them. Same with a pastor, they might have a mentor or even a church board or elders, deacons, but someone that they can call if things get hard or tough. In lots of different areas of life, the people doing well are the ones surrounded by help, not the ones white-knuckling it completely alone. But I think with infertility, and maybe even as Christians, I think sometimes we almost feel like we're supposed to quietly carry it by ourselves because, Jesus should be enough. He should be our strength. But as I said before, God works through people and other ways as well. Just ordinary ways, ordinary things, ordinary people. There is real help out there right now today if you need it. And I know sometimes even that step can feel overwhelming because you might not even know where to start. A GP can be a really good first step. They can help you work out what support that might be helpful and point you towards someone who understands this space. There's psychologists and counsellors who work specifically with infertility and grief and the emotional weight that comes with this journey. And there's also support groups. Some of them are in person and some of them are online. There might be people in your church who you trust who can walk alongside you, a pastor, a friend, someone who can pray with you and listen and just sit with you in the hard parts. Not every person or group out there will be helpful, so I think it's worth being a bit discerning about whose advice you actually let shape how you're thinking, but that's different to avoiding help altogether. And while I'm talking about support, this is something that I'm really passionate about. And I'm actually working towards creating a program that helps you navigate this season in a way that's biblically grounded, but also really practical. Somewhere that you can connect with other women going through the same experience, where you can build skills for the hard days, and you can have a place where you can process what's happening and bounce things off others without feeling like you have to figure it out all by yourself. It's still in the early stages and I'll share more as it comes together, but I wanted you to know that that's what's in the works. I know how much I would have liked to have something like this for support when I was going through infertility myself. But whether the support you need comes from me or a GP or a friend or your pastor, the point stands either way. There's no shame in getting help, none. And the tools you learn from getting support, they don't just help you with this season. They can help you for the rest of your life. You don't have to grit your teeth and get through this completely on your own. So before I go, I just want to say that none of the things that I've talked about today are meant to add more pressure or become another list of things that you need to do perfectly. Infertility takes up a lot of your energy and capacity. These are simply just a few things to keep in mind if you've noticed that this season is starting to affect you more deeply, or that you really just don't feel like yourself anymore. None of them can take away the grief of another negative test or answer every question that you have for God, and they can't promise the outcome that you're hoping for right in this moment. But my hope is that they may help make this hard time a little more bearable, protect the parts of your life that matter, and remind you that infertility doesn't have to become the only thing that you can see. And if today has made you realise that you've been struggling for longer than you thought, or you're carrying more than you can manage on your own, please don't ignore that. There is support available, and you don't have to carry this on your own. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you next week. Bye. Before you go, thank you so much for listening. I pray today's episode has brought you fresh hope for whatever comes next. If someone comes to mind today who could truly use support in this space, please share this episode or the podcast with them. It might be exactly what they need. And if you could take 30 seconds to give me a star rating or leave 1 or 2 sentences about what this podcast has meant to you on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, I'd be ever so grateful. Your feedback not only helps others find the podcast, but it truly makes my day. And words of affirmation are my love language. And if you're not sure how to do that, I'll pop the links in the show notes below. Lastly, although I do have a nursing degree, everything shared in this podcast is for inspiration and education only. Please don't use it as a replacement for advice from your personal, medical or mental health professional. There's absolutely no shame in getting additional support when you need it, but always consult your expert team before making any changes to your fertility journey. That's all from me today. Take care, and I'll catch you next time. Bye.